Her husband left her pregnant at the Stagecoach stop, with no money and no name. The Stagecoach had been gone maybe 2 hours when I rode in. I knew that because the wheel ruts in the clay were still clean at the edges, hadn't crumbled yet, hadn't been touched by the wind. 2 hours, maybe less. Hot July, the kind that makes the air above the flats go silver and wavy like something's burning underneath the ground. I'd been riding since before first light, heading north to pick up a contract load of horses from a man named Burl Cassidy, which is about the least interesting thing I ever did in my life. And I'd stopped at the Rincon relay station because my horse needed water and I needed something that wasn't dried venison. The station was a low adobe building with a brush arbor lean-to on the east side. Hector Vines ran it, a thick man with a ginger mustache who smelled like coal oil and never looked directly at you when he talked. There were 2 station hands boys, both leaning against the corral fence doing nothing the way young men do when there's a woman nearby they don't know what to make of. She was sitting on the long bench outside the station door. Her back was straight. That's the first thing I noticed, her back, the way she held it, like she was determined not to be seen wilting in front of anybody. A canvas travel bag sat beside her, not large. She had both hands resting on her lap, fingers laced together, and she wasn't looking at the road. She was looking at the ground about 4 feet in front of her feet. I tied my horse and went inside. Hector was behind the plank counter. He had a ledger open that he wasn't writing in. I said, "Water for the horse, and whatever you've got hot." He said, "Got beans, got cornbread from this morning." I said, "That do." He started ladling and then he said, without looking up, "That woman out there, you see her when you rode in?" I said I had. He said, "Stage dropped her off. She don't have a ticket onward, don't have money for one. Her husband was supposed to be meeting her here." He paused. "Wasn't nobody here." I took the bowl and the bread, and I sat down at the single table. The bench out front was visible through the window, which didn't have glass in it, just a square cut in the adobe. I could see her back, still straight. I said, "How far along is she?" Hector looked up then for once. 6 months, give or take. I ain't a doctor." I ate. I didn't hurry, but I didn't drag it out either. When I was done, I put down 3 cents and went back outside and tied my bedroll tighter, taking my time, and after a while I walked over and sat on the other end of the bench. She didn't look at me, I didn't look at her. I said, "Where were you headed?" She said, "Tucson." "Where'd you come from?" A pause. "El Paso." "Long ride?" "Yes." I pulled my hat off and set it on my knee. The heat was something you just accepted by that hour. I said, "Your husband give a reason?" She was quiet so long I thought maybe she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "He gave a lot of reasons. None of them were true." I turned the hat brim in my fingers. After a bit I said, "I'm going north, not south, so Tucson's the wrong direction for me. But I know a woman in Caballo Wells that's about 9 miles northeast of here, runs a clean boarding house. Takes women in sometimes when situations are what they are. Her name is Dora Fleming. If you want, I'll ride you there." She looked at me then, first time. Her eyes were dark brown and she'd been crying sometime in the last few hours. The redness was still there underneath, but she wasn't crying now. She looked at me the way someone looks at a door they're trying to decide is safe to open. She said, "Why?" Not a question, exactly. More like something she needed to hear answered out loud. I said, "Because it's the right thing to do." She looked at me another moment, then she looked back at the ground. She said, "My name is Clara Hewson, except I don't suppose it is any more or he'll deny the marriage, which is what men like him do." Her voice was flat and plain, like she was reporting the weather. "I have 43 cents. He took everything else. Took it before we left El Paso, I just didn't know." I said, "My name is Del Morro, and 43 cents is 43 cents more than nothing." She almost smiled, didn't quite get there but almost. That was the beginning of it. I want to be careful how I tell the rest, because I've told parts of it before to different people at different times, and the shape of it comes out different depending on what they think they're being told. Some people hear it as a story about a woman who had a bad time and got helped, which is true, but it's not the whole of it. Some hear it as a story about a man doing a good deed, which is partially true but makes it sound simpler than it was and makes me sound better than I deserve. What it actually was, and I've had 20 years to sit with this, was the first time in a long while that I was squarely needed for exactly what I was. Let me explain that because it matters. I was 51 years old that summer. I'd spent most of my adult life working as a tracker and scout, first for the Army during the Apache campaigns, which is a part of my history I have complicated feelings about that I won't get into at length, except to say that I did work I'm not proud of, and I also refused work that would have gotten me hanged if I'd done it, and that I knew the land and the people on it better than most white men ever would, and was paid about a quarter of what the Army paid its white scouts. After the campaigns wound down, I spent 7 or 8 years doing odd contracting, tracking stolen horses, sometimes people, guiding survey crews, occasionally guiding Army patrols when someone with my particular knowledge was needed for a short stretch. The Army used me when I was useful. When I wasn't, I didn't exist. I had a half-blood Apache lineage on my mother's side that I didn't talk about in Anglo towns and didn't hide in other places. That put me at the edge of both worlds all my life, welcome enough when someone needed something I had, not quite welcome enough any other time. I'd been married once before all of it. My wife, Nell, died of fever in the winter of 1879. We'd had 11 years together, which was more than a lot of people got. I didn't remarry. After Nell, I moved around too much and stayed in places too inhospitable for that kind of thinking. By the summer I rode into the Rincon station. I was a man who had been competent and useful his whole life and had very little to show for it that you could hold in your hand. I owned my horse, my gear, a rifle that was better than what most men carried, and a small parcel of land out past the Dragoon foothills that I'd taken as partial payment for a job 3 years before and hadn't figured out what to do with yet. And then there was Clara Hewson, who needed exactly the things I was. I rode her to Caballo Wells on a borrowed station horse. Hector let me take one of the relay animals for the afternoon, and I'd bring it back before nightfall. Clara rode straight, same as she'd sat on the bench. The canvas bag was across her saddle horn. We didn't talk much on the ride. I pointed out a red-tailed hawk working a thermal above the east ridge, and she watched it for a while without saying anything, and I figured that was about all the conversation either of us needed right then. Dora Fleming's place was a 2-story adobe at the north end of Caballo Wells, painted white once upon a time, faded now to the color of old bone. Dora was a widow in her 50s, a practical woman with small, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and she'd been running the boarding house for 11 years. She and I had a history, nothing romantic. Before anyone mistakes it, she'd sheltered one of my informants during a manhunt in '84, and I'd done her a service in return that I won't detail. We trusted each other the way people trust each other, when they've both kept their word under pressure. I knocked. Dora came to the door, looked at me, looked at Clara. She said, "Come in." I explained the situation briefly while Clara stood in the front room looking at the wooden floor. Dora listened without interrupting, which was her way. When I was done, she looked at Clara and said, "You can take the back room on the 2nd floor. It's small, but it's cool in the afternoon. I take $2 a week for room and board." Clara said, "I have 43 cents. Dora said, "Then we'll figure it out." I left them to it, rode back to Rincon, returned the horse, got on my own, and headed north to pick up Burl Cassidy's horses. That should have been the end of it. In my experience, that's usually how those things went. You did the right thing, you moved on, the world kept spinning. But about 4 miles out of Rincon, I stopped the horse on a piece of high ground and sat there for a while looking north across the flats. I thought about the way she'd asked, why? I thought about the 43 cents. I turned around. I told Dora I'd cover Clara's room and board through the end of August. Dora looked at me for a moment with those small, sharp eyes, and then she said, "All right," and wrote it in her ledger. $42 more than I was making on the horse contract, but I had a bit set by. I did not go upstairs and tell Clara this. I didn't want anything from it. I wasn't trying to make myself known to her as a benefactor, wasn't trying to be owed. I just didn't want her to have that worry on top of everything else she was carrying. I went north and got the horses and drove them to the buyer in Wilcox and came back through Caballo Wells 3 weeks later because it was on my route, and I thought I'd check that things were all right. They were not all right. I found out from the man at the feed store, a talker, the kind every small town has, that Clara's husband, whose name was Arvid Hewson, had actually showed up about a week after she'd arrived. He'd come in on the southbound stage, gone to Dora's, demanded to see his wife, and when Dora had said she'd have to ask Clara first, he'd apparently made threats of a legal nature, said he was going to have Clara committed to an institution in Tucson, said she was hysterical and not in her right mind, said the child wasn't his. The feed store man told me this with the particular relish people have for other people's disasters. I said, "What did Clara say?" He blinked. "About what?" "About whether she'd see him." Oh, he thought about it. Dora said she wouldn't come down, stayed in her room. Hewson sat in the front parlor for about an hour and then left. I went to Dora's. Dora met me at the door and said, "I was hoping you'd come back," which was about as much emotion as Dora ever showed. She told me Hewson would return, she was certain of it, that he had money and she didn't think he was finished. She said there was a lawyer in Tucson he'd apparently been corresponding with. She said Clara was frightened in a way she was trying not to show, which, Dora said, was what frightened her most. I went up and knocked on the back room door. Clara opened it. She'd gotten a little larger in 3 weeks. Her hair was down and she had a book open in one hand, her finger keeping the page. She looked at me and said, "Mr. Morrow." I said I heard. She stepped back so I could come in. It was a small room, a bed, a table, a single chair, a window that looked out onto the side yard where Dora kept a kitchen garden. She sat on the bed. I sat in the chair. She said, "He'll come back." I said, "I know. He wants the child, not because he wants it," she said, "but because he doesn't want me to have it. That's how he is. He takes things from people because it diminishes them, not because it serves him." I looked at the window. Outside, the kitchen garden was green in the late afternoon light. Dora kept it well. There were sunflowers at the far edge, tall ones, heads starting to turn. I said, "What would help you most right now? Not what you think you can ask for, what would actually help." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Someone who doesn't go away." I didn't say anything immediately. I looked at my hands, scarred, brown, the left one missing the tip of the ring finger from an incident in '82 that I'd never thought much about since. Working hands. The hands of a man who'd spent his life being useful and temporary. I said, "I can stay in Caballo Wells for a while. I've got the piece of land out past the Dragoons that doesn't have anything on it yet. There's water on it. I've been meaning to build something." She looked at me. "Why?" she said again. And again I said, "Because it's the right thing to do." But this time she smiled, actually smiled all the way. And she said, "You said that same thing the first time." I said, "It's still true." The thing about Arvid Hewson was that he'd underestimated what kind of place Caballo Wells was, and the kind of place it was one where people watched. This was not necessarily a comfortable quality when you were the one being watched, and I knew something about that. But when a man like Hewson came riding in with a Tucson lawyer in tow, the watching worked in a different direction. He came back in September, 6 weeks after the first visit. I was in town. I'd been splitting time between the land out east, where I'd gotten a start on a foundation and a partial wall, and a room I was renting at the far end of Dora's, and I heard his name before I saw him. Two men at the livery talking, one of them having recognized Hewson from his first visit. The way they talked about it made clear that the town had not forgotten his first visit, or the threats, or the part about a pregnant woman being committed to an institution for being hysterical. Small western towns had their own justice. It wasn't always fair and it wasn't always right, but it was consistent. And one of the things it was consistent about was men who tried to do what Hewson was trying to do. I found him and his lawyer at Dora's front parlor. Hewson was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, sandy-haired, a suit that cost more than I made in 2 months. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to rooms going the way he planned them. The lawyer was a small man named Carver, with a leather document case on his knee. I came in and stood in the doorway. Dora was there too, to the side, arms crossed. Hewson looked at me and said, "Who are you?" I said, "Del Morrow. I'm the man who's been paying your wife's room and board." He looked at me with a kind of contempt that was almost interesting, the kind that's automatic, that doesn't stop to take stock of what it's looking at. He said, "That's no concern of mine." I said, "The magistrate's office in Wilcox might think it is." Carver, the lawyer, shifted slightly. Magistrates' offices were his concern. I said, "A man abandons his pregnant wife at a stagecoach relay station with no money, takes the money before they left. Then when she finds shelter, he comes back to take the child and have her committed. I've got affidavits." I didn't have affidavits. I had something better, which was that I was prepared to get affidavits and Hewson couldn't know the difference. Dora Fleming will testify. The station agent at Rincon will testify. I'll testify. Hewson's jaw moved. Carver said, very quietly to Hewson, "I did indicate there were complications." I said, "The other complication is this. The territorial law on abandonment is pretty clear about what a husband owes a wife and child. What's less clear, and more interesting, is what happens when a man publicly denies paternity of a child that was conceived in wedlock. Because then you're not just fighting a woman, you're fighting the court's interest in not having destitute children become public burdens." I didn't know if this was precisely the law, but it sounded like the law, and it was the kind of thing that made lawyers nervous. Carver was definitely nervous. He had his document case open and was looking at papers. I said, "I'm going to ask you to leave. You can come back with a better plan or you can make your peace with the situation. But there is no version of today that ends with that woman going to Tucson against her will." Hewson was looking at me with something different now, not contempt, the thing that lives underneath contempt when it gets stripped away. He said, "You've got no standing here." I said, "Maybe not. But I've got time, and this town's got memory, and I know every person between here and Wilcox who matters to any proceeding you might want to start." He left. Carver followed, looking relieved. Dora waited until the sound of their horses died down the road, and then she said, "The part about the affidavits was good." I said, "I can get affidavits." "I know," she said, "but you don't have them yet." "No," I said, "but it's the right thing to do." She gave me the same look Clara had given me twice, like she was trying to figure something out, and then she said, "Go tell Clara." Clara was in the kitchen garden when I came through the side gate. She was pulling tomatoes off the vine Dora had asked her to, and Clara had taken to the garden the way some people take to something they'd never done before and found out they were made for. She was big now, 8 months along, and she moved carefully, but she moved. She heard the gate and looked up. I told her what had happened, not dramatically, just the facts of it in order. When I was done, she stood there holding a tomato in each hand, looking at me. She said, "He won't come back." I said, "I don't know. Men like that, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. but if he does, I'll be here." She looked at me for a long time. The sunflowers were behind her, taller now, heavy-headed in the afternoon light. There was a smear of garden dirt on her wrist. She said, "Dell," first time she'd used my first name, "can I ask you something plain?" I said she could. She said, "Are you doing all of this because you want something from me?" I said no. She said, "Are you doing it because you feel sorry for me?" I said no, I respect you. Those are different things. She looked down at the tomatoes in her hands, set them in the basket at her feet. Then she straightened up and looked at me with the directness I'd come to know was just how she was. She didn't circle, didn't soften, didn't look away. She said, "I think you're the best man I've ever met, and I'm including my father, who was a very good man." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what to do with that. My whole life people had told me I was useful, capable, good at things. Nobody had ever said that to me in that particular way, as a plain fact stated out loud without wanting anything from it. She said, "I'm not saying that to be obligated to you. I'm saying it because it's true and you ought to know it." I said, "Thank you, Clara." She picked up her basket. I held the gate. We went inside. The child was born in October, on a Wednesday, in the blue hour before dawn. I was outside on the porch, which is where Dora had sent me 3 hours earlier with a cup of coffee and the firm instruction that there was nothing useful I could do inside. The coffee was long gone. I was sitting on the porch step with my back against the post, watching the sky above the eastern ridge lighten from black to purple to a dark, deep blue, and I was thinking about Nell, which I often did in October, and about the land out past the Dragoons, which now had 3 walls and a proper roof on the east half, and about what a man does with the remainder of his life when most of it is behind him and more of it than expected is still ahead. Dora opened the door at 6:17 by my watch. She said, "Girl, Mother's fine." I let out a breath I hadn't known I'd been holding. I went inside and up the stairs. Clara was in the bed, propped on pillows, the child wrapped in a white cloth in the crook of her arm. The lamplight was gold and soft. Clara's hair was loose and dark against the pillow. She looked tired the way people look tired after enormous effort, the bones of the face showing more plainly, everything stripped down to what it actually is. She looked at me and said, "Come see her." I sat on the edge of the chair beside the bed and looked at the child. Tiny face, shut eyes, the dark fuzz of hair. She was making small, satisfied sounds. Clara said, "I'm going to name her Alina, after your wife." I looked up at that. Clara said, "Dora told me. I hope that's all right." I said, "That's more than all right." She reached out and put her hand on mine, the scarred one, the one with the missing fingertip. Her hand was small and warm, and she just rested it there on top of mine for a moment, looking at the child. She said, "Stay, Dell." Not a question, not quite. Something between a question and a fact. I said, "I'm not going anywhere." She said, "I know, but I wanted to say it out loud." She looked up at me. "I want you here because I want you here. Not because I need you, I think I could manage, but because you're the person I want beside me. That's different. That matters." I looked at her hand on mine. Alina made her small sounds. Outside, the October dawn was coming in through the window, pale gold now, the kind of light that belongs to mornings after long nights. I said, "I know the difference." She squeezed my hand once, and then settled back against the pillows. There's things that came after that are part of the story, too. The business with the Tucson lawyer coming back in the spring with a different approach, which didn't go any better for him. The finishing of the house out past the Dragoons, and the moving of the 3 of us out there in April, when Alina was 6 months old and already had opinions about everything. The marriage in a preacher's parlor in Wilcox on a Saturday in May with Dora Fleming and 2 of her boarders as witnesses. The way Clara took to the land like she'd been made for it, same as the garden. The way she'd walk out to the East Ridge in the morning with Alina on her hip, and watched the sun come up over the dragoons. Hewson filed papers twice more and dropped them both times. Last I heard he was in San Francisco with a different wife, which was her problem now. But what I want to get at, the thing I've been circling around this whole telling, is something that happened in the second year. It was winter, February, cold, a wet gray cold that we don't get often down there, but when we do it sits in the bone. I'd been out all day checking fence line on the north side of the property, a job that needed doing and that I'd put off longer than I should have. I came back to the house at dusk, cold through, my hands barely working right, and I stamped into the front room and there was firelight and the smell of pine smoke and supper on the stove. And Alina was on the floor with a wooden horse I'd carved her, playing some elaborate game only she understood, and Clara was at the table mending something by lamplight. She looked up when I came in. She put down the mending and stood up. She didn't say anything about the cold or ask about the fence. She just came over and put both arms around me, around the outside of my coat, all the mud and the cold of it, and held on. After a moment she said into my shoulder, quiet enough that it was just for me, "I'm glad you're home." I put my arms around her. Alina ignored all of us, deeply involved in her horse's journey across the floor. I stood there in that firelit room with this woman's arms around me, this woman who had chosen me, not out of desperation, not out of debt, but because I was the person she wanted, and I understood something I hadn't had words for before. My whole life I'd been useful to the army, useful to cattlemen, useful to anyone who needed something tracked or found or guided through country they didn't know. And when the use was done, I was done, set aside, not seen. Clara saw me. Not what I could do, me, the whole shape of the thing. That's what I'd been needing. All those years I'd been telling myself I didn't need anything. Alina's 11 now. She's got Clara's dark eyes and some stubbornness I'll take partial credit for. She rides better than I did at her age, which is not something I'd admit to just anyone, but is the plain truth. The land has been good to us. We run about 60 head and have an arrangement with 2 neighboring ranchers that works for everyone. Clara's out there this morning. I can see her from this window. She's at the fence by the big juniper, talking to one of the mares through the rails, which is a thing she does in the early morning before the rest of the work begins. She has a blanket around her shoulders against the chill. The light's coming sideways off the eastern ridge, the way it does in November, and it's catching her hair, which has gone a little silver at the temples now, same as mine. I watch her and I think, that woman walked through something that would have broken most people. She sat on a bench in a relay station with 43 cents and a straight back and didn't let herself wilt. And then when she was steady enough, she chose me. Plainly and on purpose, with her eyes open to exactly what I was. I spent most of my life being useful to people who forgot me as soon as I wasn't. Then I stopped at a relay station on a hot July afternoon to water my horse, and a woman on a bench looked up at me and asked me why, and I told her the truth, and the truth was enough. I was enough. That's the whole of it.